I found out on a Tuesday morning, standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store 3 towns away from where I grew up. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor Paulette, the woman who had lived next door to my parents' house for 31 years. She said the words simply, the way people say things when they assume you already know. Saw the sold sign out front. Hope the new family loves it as much as yours did. I stood there holding a box of oatmeal, reading those 11 words 4 times. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't been called. I hadn't even known the house was listed. My brother Corey had sold our childhood home without telling me a single word. I drove straight there. 2 hours and 14 minutes. I pulled up to the house on Birchwood Lane just as a couple was walking out of the front door holding a printed floor plan. Corey was standing in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, watching me climb out of my car with the expression of someone who had been expecting this but had hoped it wouldn't happen today. He said, almost before I could open my mouth, "Dad left it to me, Nora. The sale is already done." I looked at the strangers touring our house. I looked at my brother. And then, from somewhere inside the house, the new owner's husband called out, "Wait, what's behind that locked wall?" The question floated up the basement stairs and out through the open front door, and for a second, nobody moved. The woman who was clearly the buyer stepped back inside, her floor plan still rolled up in her hand. Corey's jaw tightened. He said too quickly, "It's nothing. Old storage. Don't worry about it." But the husband, a tall man named Philip, had already come up the stairs with his eyebrows pushed together and his phone out, like he was looking something up. He told us the inspection report hadn't mentioned any sealed doorway. That whoever had done the inspection either missed it or skipped it. Corey said again that it was nothing, just an old wall, probably sealed when the pipes were rerouted years ago. His voice had that forced steadiness to it, the kind people use when they are working very hard not to sound nervous. I had known my brother for 37 years. I could hear the difference. The buyers exchanged a look. The wife, whose name I would later learn was Serena, said she wanted it looked at before they finalized the paperwork with the title company. Corey said the paperwork was already filed. She said that didn't matter to her. I said nothing. I was still trying to understand how the house had been sold at all. But something my father told me once, a long time ago, had started pulling at the back of my mind. He had said it quietly, the way he said things he meant to last, every house has a room no one else knows about. I drove home that evening in a fog. My husband Terence had dinner waiting. He took one look at my face and turned the stove down without a word. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to organize what I knew, which wasn't much. Corey had called no one. He had listed the house, found buyers, and moved through the entire sale process without once picking up the phone to tell me. Dad had been gone 11 months. The grief was still raw enough that I hadn't pushed for details about the estate. I had trusted Corey to handle things fairly, the way our father had trusted both of us with everything. That was my first mistake. But it was the memory surfacing on that drive home that really unsettled me. I was 9 years old. Dad had taken me downstairs to the basement on a Saturday afternoon, when Corey was at soccer practice. He had pressed his hand flat against a section of the wall near the back, behind the water heater, and looked at me with that serious expression he saved for important conversations. He said, "There's a room back here that nobody else knows about. I want you to remember where it is." I had laughed. I thought he was playing pretend, the way he sometimes did when I was small. He hadn't laughed back. He had just looked at me steadily and said, "Don't tell Corey." At the time I thought it was a game. I had forgotten about it completely, buried under 30 years of normal life. Standing in that kitchen with Terence watching me quietly, I realized it had never been a game at all. The call came at 11:17 that night. I was still awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with my phone in my lap, looking up property trust laws in our state. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but the area code was local to Birchwood Lane. I answered on the second ring. It was Philip, the husband from the house. He spoke carefully, like someone who wasn't sure they were doing the right thing but had decided to do it anyway. He said they had found my name and number on a piece of old mail that had been left behind in a kitchen drawer. He said he and his wife had gone back to the house that evening after the walkthrough and spent some time in the basement. He said the wall was definitely hollow. He could hear it when he knocked. He said the real estate agent had been unhelpful when he asked about it, and that Corey hadn't returned his calls since the afternoon. Then he asked me something I wasn't expecting. He said, "Do you know what's back there?" I was quiet for a moment. I told him about the memory, the one from when I was 9. I told him what Dad had said about a room no one else knew about. Philip was quiet too for a few seconds. Then he said that he and Serena were thinking about opening the wall. He said they had a right to know what was on their property before they accepted final transfer of the deed. I told him I thought that was reasonable. Before we hung up, he said, "We'll call you when we know something." I lay back on the pillow and stared at the ceiling until morning came. Corey called me the next morning at 7:43. I was on my second cup of coffee, watching the backyard through the kitchen window. I let it ring twice before I answered, just to settle myself. He didn't say hello. He said, "Did you talk to the new owners about the basement?" His voice had that tight quality again, the same one I had heard in the driveway. I told him no, which was technically true. They had called me. He was quiet for a moment, and in that silence I could hear something working behind his words. Not guilt exactly. Something more calculated than guilt. I asked him why he was asking. He said he just wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page, that the basement was nothing, that he didn't want the buyers getting spooked over an old wall and backing out of the deal. I said the deal was already done, according to him. He didn't have a response to that. I told him I hadn't said anything to cause problems. That was true, though the rest of what I was thinking I kept to myself. He said okay. He said he was glad. And then he hung up without saying goodbye, which Corey always did when he was done with a conversation he hadn't planned well. I put my phone face down on the counter and thought about the way his voice had cracked, just slightly, on the word basement. Something was behind that wall. Something he already knew about. And he was very, very afraid of what would happen when it came out. The text came at 2:17 the next afternoon. Just a photo, no caption, no explanation. I was at my desk at work, halfway through a report, and my phone lit up with Philip's name. I opened the image and set down my pen. The wall was gone. Not cracked, not opened, but completely removed. The cinder blocks had been taken out cleanly, stacked to one side of the frame, and where the sealed section had been there was now a dark rectangular opening about 4 feet wide. And inside that opening, just barely visible at the edge of the flashlight beam in the photo, were the top 3 steps of a staircase leading downward. I stared at the image for a long time. The steps were wooden, finished, not rough concrete. Someone had built them carefully. Someone had put effort and thought into what was down there. I called Philip back. He picked up on the first ring and said they had hired a contractor to remove the wall that morning once the final deed transfer was confirmed as legally pending, not complete as Corey had claimed. He said the staircase went down about 12 feet below the basement floor. He said he hadn't gone all the way down yet. He was waiting. I asked him what he was waiting for. He said, "Honestly? I thought you should know first." I thanked him. He said there was no need. I left work early that afternoon and drove back to Birchwood Lane for the second time in 3 days. The underground room was nothing like I expected. I had pictured something small and dark, a crawl space maybe, or a storage nook with a couple of boxes. What we walked into was a fully built room, roughly the size of a large bedroom, with a concrete floor, a battery-powered ventilation unit mounted in the upper corner, and shelves lining 3 of the 4 walls. The shelves were old but sturdy. My father had built them the same way he built everything, carefully and meant to last. The boxes on the shelves were labeled in his handwriting, black marker on masking tape, organized by year going back to at least 2009. The dates caught my breath. 2009 was the year Dad's health had started to slip. The year he had his first scare with his heart and began to slow down. I walked the shelves slowly, reading each label. The earliest boxes were at the top. The most recent ones, from just 2 years ago, were at eye level. Every single one had a second word on the label beside the year, just one word, repeated on every box: records. In the middle of the room, bolted into the concrete floor with what looked like heavy anchor bolts, was a metal safe. It was the size of a small filing cabinet. The keypad on the front had a thin layer of dust on it, but the steel was solid and unrusted. Philip stood behind me and said quietly, "We found that the moment we came down. We haven't touched it." I crouched in front of it and pressed my palm flat against the cold metal, just the way Dad had once pressed his palm against the hidden wall upstairs. Corey showed up before we could do anything with the safe. I heard the front door open upstairs and his voice carrying down, sharp and demanding, saying he needed access to the basement immediately. Philip went up to meet him. I stayed in the underground room, standing between the shelves and the safe, listening to the voices above me. Corey said the property transfer wasn't fully complete, that there were still technical details being resolved and that gave him legal standing to access the premises. Philip said calmly that his attorney had confirmed the sale paperwork had cleared the title company's processing queue and that they were now the lawful occupants. Corey's voice got louder. He said there were items of personal property in this house that belonged to his family and he had a right to retrieve them. Serena's voice joined in, steady and firm, saying that any items left behind after a property sale became part of the sale under their contract, and that if he had concerns, he should have his attorney contact their attorney. I heard Corey say, "That basement is mine." There was a pause. Then Philip said evenly, "Then you should have thought about that before you sold the house." The argument above me continued for another few minutes. But they didn't let him in. I heard the front door close again, and then Philip's footsteps on the stairs, and he appeared at the bottom with an expression that was somewhere between satisfied and shaken. "He's gone," he said. "For now." I nodded and turned back to the shelves. While Corey had been arguing at the front door, Serena had stayed in the underground room with me. She was a quiet, careful woman, and she didn't touch anything without asking first, which I appreciated more than I could say. Together, we had lifted down one of the labeled boxes from the middle shelf. The year marked on it was 2017. The tape was sealed tightly but not locked, and when I pulled it open, the smell of old paper rose up, familiar and faintly dusty, exactly like Dad's home office. Inside were folders. Neat, tabbed, labeled in the same black marker. Each folder had a name on it. I flipped through them one by one. Several were financial records I didn't immediately understand. But every single folder in that box had either my name on it or both of our names together. Not one was labeled only for Corey. I pulled out a folder dated March 2017 and opened it carefully. Inside was a document I recognized on sight, a trust agreement, the kind estates use to manage property when the owner wants to control what happens after death. My father's signature was at the bottom. His lawyer's notary stamp was in the corner. And attached to the back, with a single paperclip, was a page that listed the terms. The house at Birchwood Lane, the document said, was to be held jointly and could not be sold, transferred, or otherwise disposed of without the documented, witnessed, and notarized signatures of both children. Both. I set the folder down carefully on the concrete floor and sat beside it. My hands were steady when I read the document a second time, but my chest was not. The trust had been drawn up in 2017, 4 years before Dad died, during a period when his health had been declining slowly and Corey had moved back to town to help. I remembered that time. I had been grateful that Corey was nearby. I had sent money when I could and driven back on weekends twice a month. I had thought we were a family doing what families did. The trust was clear and detailed. The house could not be sold without both signatures. Mine was required. My signature was nowhere on the sale documents Corey had filed. The trust document even spelled out the consequence. Any sale attempted without both signatures would be legally voidable. Meaning, Corey had known about this. He had to have known. The trust had been filed with Dad's lawyer. It would have been part of any estate review. Corey had moved through the sale anyway, without telling me, without my signature, without a single conversation. I thought about what that meant. Not just the house, not just the money. I thought about the 11 months since Dad died, while I grieved and trusted and waited. I thought about Corey standing in that driveway saying Dad left it to me with that flat, certain voice. He had looked me in the eye and said it. He had said it like a truth. I stood up, brushed dust from my knees, and asked Serena if she had a phone charger I could borrow. Buried beneath the 2017 trust folder, near the bottom of the same box, was a sealed envelope. It had not been opened. The outside was plain white, slightly yellowed at the edges, with my name written in my father's handwriting. Just my name. Nora. Not Corey's name. Not both of ours. Mine alone. Underneath my name, in smaller letters, was a line that made my throat tighten. Open only if the house is ever sold without you. I sat on the floor of that underground room for a long moment with the envelope in my hands. Philip had come back down by then and was standing quietly near the stairs with Serena, giving me space. I turned the envelope over. It was sealed with tape as well as glue, the way my father sealed things when he wanted to make sure they stayed closed until the right time. I thought about the Saturday afternoon when I was 9 years old. I thought about Dad's hand on the wall and his serious expression and the words he had said. I thought about how I had dismissed it as a game. He had been building something back then, or planning to. He had been putting pieces in place for a moment he hoped would never come but prepared for anyway, because that was who he was. He was the kind of man who built hidden rooms and sealed envelopes and trusted his daughter to remember. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper. The letter inside was 1 page handwritten, dated 3 years before Dad died. He had written it in the same careful print he used for everything important, the letters even and deliberate, like he wanted to make sure I could read every word without question. He told me that he had hired his lawyer, a man named Mr. Fenwick, to oversee a trust protecting the house. He said he had done this because he had begun to notice things he didn't want to believe. He said the letter was only for me, and he was sorry for that, but that there were reasons he would explain in the safe. He said, if the house has been sold without your knowledge or your signature, open the safe. The combination, he wrote, was the year I was born, followed by the year of my college graduation, followed by a single additional number he had once told me privately. I knew the number immediately. It was the number of steps on the front porch of the house on Birchwood Lane. 7 steps. He had made me count them once when I was small, saying that knowing your own house was a kind of safety. I looked up at Philip. I told him I knew the combination. He nodded and stepped back. I walked to the safe, crouched in front of the keypad, and typed in the numbers my father had left for me, and only me, across a distance of years. The lock released with a clean, solid click. Inside the safe were 3 things: a set of flash drives in a small plastic case, a thick envelope of property records and bank statements, and a smaller sealed envelope with Mr. Fenwick's name and address on the outside and the words "deliver" if needed written below. I didn't open Mr. Fenwick's envelope. I set it aside carefully. I opened the bank statements first because they were the most immediate and the easiest to read without a lawyer present. The records went back 9 years. They covered multiple accounts, most of which I recognized as my father's regular savings and checking. But one account I had never seen before, labeled simply with a reference number, showed a pattern that made me go very still. Starting in 2014, 3 years before Dad drew up the trust, there had been regular transfers out of my father's main savings. Small at first. $200. $500. Then larger. The transfers grew over time as Dad's health declined and his ability to monitor his finances closely decreased. By 2019, the amounts were significant. Thousands at a time. The transfers were made by proxy authorization, meaning someone had been given access to move money on Dad's behalf. The proxy name on the authorization form was Corey's. My brother had been draining my father's accounts for years while our father's health slowly failed. And my father had been quietly, carefully, documenting every single transfer. I went through the records slowly, page by page, with Serena sitting beside me and Philip standing at the shelf pulling down additional boxes as I needed them. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Corey hadn't just sold the house. That was the final move in a much longer game. The earliest records showed a small loan Corey had asked Dad for in 2014, $10,000 to help him through a rough patch at work. Dad had given it willingly. But the repayments had stopped after 4 months and Dad had never pressed him. The next transfer was in 2015, another loan larger. Then another in 2016. By the time Dad had drawn up the trust in 2017, the total amount transferred to Corey's accounts across 3 years was substantial. But the thing that stopped me completely was the folder at the very bottom of the bank records envelope. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a copy of the will. I had never seen the original. I had asked Corey about it twice in the 11 months since Dad passed, and both times he had said the lawyer was still processing things. He had said it the way you say things you are hoping someone will stop asking about. I opened the will with steady hands. I read it from the top. And I found in the clear, plain language my father always used, that he had split everything equally between us. The house. The remaining savings. The contents of the property. Everything. 50 and 50. Corey had lied about the will from the very beginning. The flash drives were still in their case. There were 4 of them, labeled in the same masking tape and black marker as the boxes on the shelves. 3 were labeled by year. The 4th was labeled simply, "Watch this first." I borrowed Philip's laptop. He opened it without hesitation and stepped back to give me room. I plugged in the 4th drive. There was one file on it. A video, 43 minutes long, dated 8 months before my father died. I pressed play. And there was my father, sitting at his kitchen table, the same table I had eaten 1,000 meals at, with a glass of water beside him and the yellow kitchen light warm above his head. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, with the careful movements of someone conserving energy. But his eyes were the same. Clear and direct and completely like himself. He looked at the camera and said, "Nora, if you're watching this, then I wasn't wrong to build the room." He paused. He picked up his water glass and set it down again. "I need to tell you what I know and what I've done about it. I'm going to take my time because I want you to understand all of it. I don't want you to be angry on my behalf. I just want you to know the truth." I sat in that underground room, beneath the house where I had grown up, and I watched my father speak to me across time. Philip and Serena had gone upstairs quietly, without being asked. The room was completely silent except for my father's voice and the faint sound of my own breathing. In the recording, Dad spoke for 43 minutes without stopping more than twice. He told me that he had started to notice small things missing from his bank balance around 2014, and that at first he had put it down to his own confusion, because his memory had been giving him trouble. But the pattern had continued, and eventually he had gone to his bank in person, without telling Corey, and asked for printed statements going back 3 years. What the bank showed him had not been a surprise, he said. Not entirely. He had suspected something, but hadn't wanted to believe it. He told me that he had then gone to Mr. Fenwick, his lawyer, and told him everything. Mr. Fenwick had advised him to document everything quietly and protect the house, which was the largest asset, through the trust. Dad said he had chosen not to confront Corey directly because he was afraid of what a confrontation would push Corey to do. He said Corey had always been reactive, always found a way to twist a situation back onto whoever had challenged him. So instead of confronting, he had built. He had spent 2 months constructing the underground room, coming down here on mornings when Corey was at work, carrying materials a few pieces at a time. He had filed everything carefully. He had made the video and the envelope and set the combination to numbers only I would know. He looked into the camera near the end and said, "I'm sorry you're the one who has to carry this. I chose you because you always remembered things that mattered." I called Terence first, then I called a lawyer. Not Mr. Fenwick, not yet. I called a woman named Ida Bosworth, an estate and property attorney who had been recommended to me by a colleague the previous year. I had saved her number without ever thinking I would need it. I described the situation in as few words as I could. I told her about the trust, the sale, the missing signature, the will. She was quiet for a moment and then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "That sale is almost certainly voidable." She explained that a trust requiring 2 signatures to authorize a sale is a legally binding document. If my signature had not been obtained, then the sale Corey had filed was not valid under the terms of the trust, regardless of what the title company had processed. Furthermore, if the will stated an equal division and Corey had represented otherwise to buyers, a title company, or an estate court, there could be additional legal exposure on his part. She asked if I had physical copies of the trust and the will. I told her I had the originals from the safe. She said, "Bring them to me tomorrow morning." I stayed in the underground room another hour after we hung up. I photographed every document with my phone and emailed the images to myself, to Terence, and to Ida Bosworth's office before I left the house that night. I drove home with the safe's contents in a bag on the passenger seat, and I did not sleep much, but I slept better than I had in 11 months. Ida moved quickly. By the following afternoon, she had contacted the title company with a copy of the trust document and formal notice that the property sale had been executed without the required co-signatory authorization. She told me the title company's response had been nearly immediate. They had pulled the original sale file and reviewed the signatures on the closing documents. What they found was that my signature appeared on the paperwork. My name, in writing that was not mine. The title company's compliance officer called Ida directly and described the signature as inconsistent with any documentation they had on file for me. They had asked Corey for verification of how my signature had been obtained, and he had not yet responded. Ida called me with this information in a voice that was calm and professional but very direct. She said the word I had been turning over in my mind since the night I read the trust. Forgery. She said it plainly, without softening it. My brother had forged my signature on the sale documents for our family home. She said this moved the situation from a civil estate dispute into potential criminal territory, and that the title company was now in a very uncomfortable position because they had approved a document they had not properly verified. She advised me to let her handle all communication from that point forward, which I agreed to without hesitation. I asked her what happened next. She said, "The title company is going to want to fix this as fast as possible. Watch how quickly things start to move." Things moved the way Ida said they would. Within 48 hours the title company had frozen the transaction. They had also, apparently, reached out to Corey's real estate agent and placed a hold on the disbursement of any sale funds. That meant the money from the sale, which Corey had presumably been counting on, had not yet been transferred to him. Ida told me this with the same professional calm, but there was a certain satisfaction underneath it that I recognized because I felt it too. Corey's response to all of this was not calm. He left 4 voicemails for Ida's office, which she did not return. He sent 2 text messages to me, the first saying there had been a misunderstanding and the second saying he wanted to talk, that things had gotten out of hand, that he needed me to back off. I showed both messages to Ida. She forwarded them to the title company's legal team. Corey also called Philip. Philip told me about it the following morning. He said Corey had asked him not to share any information with investigators or the title company, that there were family matters involved that were private. Philip had listened to everything Corey said and then told him politely that the documents found on his property had already been shared with the relevant parties, that he and Serena had a legal and moral obligation to cooperate, and that if Corey had concerns he should direct them to an attorney. Corey had hung up. Philip told me this story with the dry steadiness of a man who had made peace with the right thing. The title company's internal investigation moved fast because title companies move fast when their own liability is involved. Ida explained it to me this way. When a title company approves a fraudulent transfer, they can be held responsible for the financial harm caused to any party who relied on that approval. In this case, the buyers, Philip and Serena, had entered into a contract in good faith. And I, as the rightful co-owner of a trust-protected property, had been entirely excluded from a transaction that required my participation. The title company had approved paperwork with a forged signature. That made them a party to the problem, whether they had intended to be or not. Their legal team called Ida twice in the same day. They said they were cooperating fully. They said they were reviewing all documentation and had already flagged the sale file for their fraud department. They said they were prepared to void the transaction and correct the record. Ida thanked them and reminded them that her client would require full documentation of the corrective steps taken. I followed all of this from my kitchen table with Terence sitting across from me, the two of us sharing a pot of coffee and talking through each development as it came in. He had taken a day off work to be home. He didn't say much, which was one of the things I had always loved about him. He just stayed close and refilled my coffee and let me think. In the evening he said quietly, "Your dad knew what he was doing." I nodded. I knew. When Corey finally responded to Ida formally, through his own attorney, the letter was full of language that tried to reframe everything. It used words like oversight and miscommunication and administrative error. His attorney wrote that Corey had believed in good faith, that he was the primary beneficiary of the estate and had proceeded with the sale on that understanding. The letter did not directly address the forged signature. When Ida pointed this out, Corey's attorney sent a second letter saying that the signature matter was under review. Ida told me what this meant in plain terms. They had no good answer for it. The trust document, the will, the bank records, and the video recording together built a picture that was very difficult to argue around. The trust showed the house required both signatures. The will showed the estate was equally divided. The financial records showed a pattern of transfers my father had documented with explicit notes. And the video showed my father, in his own words, explaining exactly what he had observed and why he had built the hidden room. Corey could claim confusion about the estate. He could not claim confusion about his own handwriting, or whoever had written my name on those closing documents. His story was falling apart piece by piece, not in a single dramatic confrontation, but in the slow and methodical way that evidence works when it has been gathered patiently and kept safe. My father had understood something I was only now learning. You don't fight dishonesty with anger. You fight it with proof. The authorities got involved in the third week. Ida had filed a formal complaint with the County Fraud Unit, attaching copies of the trust, the will, the sale documents, and an expert comparison of the forged signature against samples of my actual handwriting. The investigation moved through official channels with less drama than the title company process, but with considerably more weight. Corey was contacted by investigators. His attorney responded on his behalf, but the documentation was solid. Within 6 weeks of that initial phone call from Philip on Birchwood Lane, the official determination came through. The sale of the property at Birchwood Lane had been executed through fraud. The documents bore a forged signature. The trust had been violated. The sale was legally void. Corey faced charges for forgery and fraudulent property transfer. The financial records from the underground room had been turned over as supplementary evidence, and the long pattern of transfers from Dad's accounts was now also under review as a separate matter. His attorney had advised him to cooperate, which I took to mean the evidence was clear enough that cooperation was all that was left. I received the legal notification on a Thursday morning. I read it once, slowly, and then set it down on the kitchen table. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel the relief I had expected. Mostly I felt tired, the specific tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and finally being allowed to set it down. I called Terence at work. He came home early. The house was now legally mine, or more precisely, the estate's, pending resolution of the trust. Philip and Serena had been kept informed throughout the process by their own attorney, and the three of us had spoken several times over the preceding weeks. They were a careful, decent pair of people who had bought a house in good faith and found themselves in the middle of something they had never anticipated. I liked them. I thought my father would have liked them too, actually. The kind of people who called when they found something that didn't belong to them and waited for the right person to come. Ida advised me on my options regarding the property. I could reclaim it outright. I could pursue compensatory damages from Corey's share of the estate and from whatever the title company's liability process yielded. Or I could reach a negotiated resolution with the buyers that allowed them to keep the house. Terence and I talked about it for 2 evenings. I had not lived on Birchwood Lane for 17 years. I had a home, a life, a different city that was mine now. Going back wasn't something I wanted. What I wanted was for the people who had done right by me, who had called at 11 at night and opened a wall and waited at the bottom of a staircase, to not be punished for someone else's dishonesty. I told Ida my decision. Philip and Serena could keep the house. Any financial recovery from Corey's portion of the estate and from the title company's liability settlement would go toward correcting every legal and financial harm that had been done. The house would have its right owners. And I would have what the house had always held for me, the truth. Corey called me himself the night before the legal settlement was finalized. I almost didn't answer, but I did. He sounded different than he had in the driveway that first afternoon. Not soft exactly, but smaller. Like something had gone out of him. He said he hadn't expected Dad to have prepared all of that. He said it in a way that was almost like a complaint, and for a moment something sharp moved through me. But I let it pass. I told him that Dad had always prepared for things he hoped would never happen. That was who he was. Corey was quiet for a while. Then he said, he knew what I was doing. I said yes. He was quiet again. I asked him why. It was the question I had been carrying since the driveway, since the cereal aisle, since 11 months of silence about an estate that should have been simple. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, almost to himself, I thought he was going to leave it all to you anyway. I sat with that for a moment. That was it. That was the whole story underneath the story. A fear, possibly wrong, maybe even completely invented, that had grown in him during all the years of our father's declining health. A fear that had turned into justification and justification into action. I didn't argue with him. I didn't tell him he was wrong, though he was. I told him that the hidden room had never been about the money. It had been about making sure the truth had somewhere to live. He didn't respond to that. He said goodbye. I said it back. I went back to Birchwood Lane one final time on a Saturday in early spring, 4 months after the settlement was complete. Philip and Serena had invited me. They had been working on the house for weeks, repainting the front room, refinishing the porch steps. Serena had planted things in the side yard that were just starting to come in. I stood at the end of the driveway for a moment before I went in, looking at the house the way you look at something when you know it's the last time. The yellow siding my father had repainted himself when I was 12. The front porch with its 7 steps. The oak tree in the side yard that had been a sapling when we moved in and was now older and wider than I could wrap my arms around. Philip met me at the door and walked me through the house, which was warm and lived in now in the way a house becomes when real life has moved into it. They had kept the kitchen layout the same, which made my throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected. And then he took me downstairs. Into the basement and down the wooden staircase my father had built alone on quiet mornings. The underground room had been cleaned out carefully. The shelves were empty now, the boxes all turned over to attorneys and investigators and the official record. But Philip and Serena had kept one thing exactly where they found it. On the middle shelf, in the center of the wall, in the spot where the first labeled box had stood, was a single envelope. My name on the front. My father's handwriting. The letter he had written for the right moment, which had finally come. I stood in that room for a long time, holding it. Philip and Serena had gone back upstairs. The room was quiet, the way underground rooms are, with a kind of stillness that feels deliberate. I read the final line again, the one I had memorized in the weeks since I'd first found it, because it was the truest thing anyone had ever written to me. Your brother thought he was taking the house. But the truth always finds its way to the surface. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket, close to me. Then I climbed the stairs back up into the light.